Here are 10 extremely brutal torture methods. The Judas Chair. Known as the Judas Chair, the chair of torture was a horrible device of the Middle Ages. While there are many variants of the chair, they all have one thing in common: spikes covering the back. To avoid movement, the victim's wrists were tied to the chair, or in one version 2 bars pushed the arms against armrests for the spikes to penetrate the flesh even further. In some versions there were holes under the chair's bottom, where the torturer placed coal to cause severe burns, while the victim still remained conscious. Who thinks of these things? This instrument's strength lies primarily in the psychological fear. It was a practice to extract a confession by forcing the victim to watch someone else being tortured, before being tortured himself. Time of death greatly varied, ranging from a few hours to a day or more. No spike penetrated any vital organ, and the wound was closed by the spike itself, which delayed blood loss. The rack is a torture device consisting of a rectangular wooden frame, slightly raised from the ground with a ruler at one or both ends. The victim's ankles are fastened to one ruler, and the wrists are chained to the other. As the interrogation progresses, a handle is used to gradually increase the tension on the chains, inducing excruciating pain. By means of pulleys and levers, this ruler could be rotated on its own axis, straining the ropes further until the sufferer's joints were dislocated and eventually separated. One particular nasty aspect of being stretched too far on the rack is the loud popping noises made by snapping bones. One powerful method of putting pressure upon prisoners was to force them to watch someone else being subjected to the rack. Confining the prisoner enabled further torture to be applied, typically including burning the victim with hot torches or candles, or using pincers made with specially roughened grips to tear the nails out of the fingers and toes. Usually the victim's shoulders and hips would be separated, and their elbows, knees, wrists would be dislocated. The Iron Maiden was an execution device consisting of an iron cabinet with a hinged front and spike-covered interior, sufficiently tall to enclose a human being. The first stories citing the Iron Maiden were composed in the 19th century. The use of Iron Maidens is a myth from the 18th century that was heightened by the belief that people of the Middle Ages were uncivilized. It's traditionally a Germanic invention, originated in the town of Nuremberg at some point in the Middle Ages, probably in the 14th century. The Brazen Bull, or Sicilian Bull, was a torture device designed in Greece. The bull was said to be made entirely out of bronze, hollow with a door in one side. According to legend, the Brazen Bull was designed in the form and size of an actual bull, and had an acoustic apparatus that converted screams into the sound of a bull. The condemned were locked inside the device and a fire was set under it, heating the metal until a person inside was roasted. Some scholars question if the Brazen Bull ever really existed, attributing reports of the fearsome invention to propaganda. The purr of anguish is the modern name for a type of instrument displayed in some museums, consisting of a metal body divided into spoon-like segments that could be operated by turning a screw. The museum descriptions and some recent sources state that the device was used either as a gag or as an instrument of torture, although these accounts have been disputed as implausible. As derived from its name, the mechanism of this contraption was originally meant to be inserted into one's mouth to crank the earpiece to expand the metallic pedals. The triple pedals expand outward, forcing the victim's inner mouth to stretch beyond its limits, rather like the Saw films, if you've ever seen those wonderful films. Donking was a form of punishment reserved for the supposed witchcraft. The victim was tied to a chair which is elevated by ropes above a pond or a vat of water. The victim was lowered into the water until submerged. The chair was raised if the victim was about to pass out or to give the victim a chance to confess. Often some form of plug or a piece of fruit was placed into the victim's mouth, so they couldn't get a good breath before being dunked. If the victim confessed, they would most likely be killed. This method was used during the Spanish Inquisition, and in England and in France, the victim was usually submerged for many hours until he or she revealed information or they died. Death by boiling is a method of execution in which a person is killed by being immersed in boiling liquid. While not as common as other methods of execution, boiling to death has been used in many parts of Europe and Asia. Boiling as an execution method was used for counterfeiters, swindlers, and coin forgers during the Middle Ages. In the Holy Roman Empire, being boiled to death in oil is recorded for coin forgerers and extremely grave murderers. In 1392, a man was boiled alive in Nuremberg for having raped and murdered his own mother. depictions in Western culture, early reports of cannibals from islands in the Pacific killing Western Christian missionaries were assumed to involve some form of boiling alive. This became a fertile ground for filmmakers and especially cartoonists, whose cliched depiction of tourists or missionaries sitting restrained in a large cauldron above a wooden fire and surrounded by bone-nosed tribesmen was a staple of popular magazines for decades. Humans have a long history of developing inventive ways to hurt each other. There's seemingly no end to the horrifying torture device that people have come up with. But one of the most terrifying methods of torture doesn't require a man-made device at all. Instead, it requires just a rat. Many people naturally feel a sense of fear and revulsion towards rats, and the animals will chew through nearly anything, including human flesh. That makes them perfect tools for torture, especially if the torturer knew how to use them. One of the most fiendish forms of rat torture involves placing a rat inside a half cage and atop a restrained victim's abdomen. Then the cage is heated. Desperate to escape the heat, the rat burrows through the only soft surface it can find, the victim's flesh. With sharp claws and teeth, the rat quickly gnaws its way into the victim's bowels, causing excruciating pain and terror. The technique was far from the only way that rats were used as instruments of torture. Around the same time as Pinochet's reign of terror in Chile, the military junta in control of Argentina devised a devilish innovation of the process. Instead of placing the rats against the flesh, the Argentines used a telescopic tube to guide the rats inside of a prisoner's body through the rectum or in through the vagina. Sometimes prisoners were simply locked inside a confined space with a group of rats. This would probably scare me. In a small room, with no way to avoid them, the prisoners would slowly be driven mad as the rats gnawed at their limbs. The idea of a rat eating into their guts or simply crawling over their limbs while they slept struck terror into victims, and when a torturer is trying to get information from someone, that fear enough can often be a more effective tool than physical pain. But the fear was also a good way to add a psychological element to the torture when the goal was simply to inflict suffering onto someone. Crucifixion is a method of capital punishment in which the victim is tied or nailed to a large wooden beam and left to hang for days. Crucifixion was often performed to dissuade its witnesses from perpetrating similar acts. Victims were sometimes left on display after a death as a warning to other people. In some cases, the condemned was forced to carry the crossbeam to the place of execution. A whole cross would weigh well over 300 pounds. The length of time required to reach death could range from hours to days depending on the method, the victim's health, and the environment. Waterboarding is a form of water torture in which the victim is poured over a cloth covering the face and breathing passages of an immobilized captive, causing the individual to experience a sensation of drowning. Ordinarily, the water is poured intermittently so as to prevent death during torture. However, if the water is poured uninterruptedly, it will lead to death by asphyxia. Besides death, waterboarding can cause extreme pain, damage to lungs, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, other physical injuries including broken bones due to struggling against restraints, and lasting psychological damage. Premature burial means to be buried while still alive. Intentional burial may occur as a form of torture, murder, or execution. It may also occur with consent of the victim as part of the stunt, with the intention to escape, like magicians. Fear of being buried alive is reported to be the most common phobias. The medical term for the fear of being buried alive is taphophobia. If you like this video, please subscribe. If you can think of any other really good torture methods, I'd be really glad to know. Bye for now.